August 12, 1943, 16:30 hours, near Hearne, Texas. The air was a physical thing, a suffocating blanket of heat and humidity, thick with the smell of dust and sun-baked earth, utterly alien to Gefreiter Klaus Richter. For months, his world had been the gray, churning Atlantic, the cramped hold of a Liberty ship reeking of sweat and vomit. Before that, it was the dust of Tunisia, the sharp metallic tang of cordite and fear. Now, stumbling from the back of a canvas-topped U.S. Army truck, his reality was recalibrating with every staggered breath. He was 21 years old, a veteran of the Africa Corps, a prisoner of war. His worn Feldgrau uniform, patched and faded, clung to his gaunt frame. In a small, sweat-stained pocket of his tunic, a folded and refolded photograph of his mother and younger sister, Anke, was a fragile anchor to a world that felt a universe away. The last letter from home, dated 6 months prior, spoke of dwindling rations and endless queues in Hamburg. Anke, he remembered his mother writing, was delighted to receive a single precious orange for her birthday. Klaus clutched the memory of that letter as the American guards, tall and strangely relaxed, motioned them forward with their M1 rifles held at a casual port arms. He and the other captured soldiers of the Deutsches Afrika Korps were a ragged column of ghosts haunting the Texas landscape. They shuffled past endless rows of identical black tar paper barracks, arranged with a geometric precision that seemed impossibly extravagant. The sheer space was bewildering, but it was the structure ahead that shattered their exhausted composure. It wasn't a building. It was a monument, a sprawling single-story edifice of wood and screens, longer and wider than the entire market square of his home village near Lüneburg. From within spilled a cacophony of noise and more powerfully a smell that made his stomach clench with a primal, forgotten longing. The aroma of roasting meat and fresh brewed coffee. The guards herded them towards this colossal structure. One of his comrades, a grizzled Obergefreiter from Stuttgart, whispered in disbelief, his voice raspy. Was ist das? Ein Offizierscasino für einen General? An officer's casino for a general? An American guard, overhearing the German, simply grinned. Nope, he said, his English a strange, lazy drawl. That's the mess hall. Chow time. Klaus looked at the building, then back at the endless Texas sky, a profound and terrifying disorientation setting in. The war he thought he knew, the enemy he had been trained to fight, and the world he believed he understood were about to be systematically dismantled, not by a weapon, but by a dinner tray. The arrival of Klaus Richter and his comrades in the heart of Texas was not a random occurrence, but the result of a colossal strategic and logistical undertaking by the United States. In early 1942, as the war escalated, Allied leaders Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a critical problem: what to do with a rapidly growing population of Axis prisoners of war. Keeping hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers in a war-torn Britain, a nation under constant threat of invasion and strict rationing, was a security and logistical nightmare. The solution was as audacious as it was pragmatic: ship them to America. This decision, codenamed Operation Cowboy, triggered one of the largest and least-known logistical efforts of the war. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States would transport and house over 425,000 prisoners of war, the vast majority, some 378,000, being German soldiers. The strategic calculus was threefold. First, it removed a massive security burden from the European theater, freeing up Allied troops, shipping, and supplies for the front lines. Second, it virtually eliminated the risk of prisoners escaping and rejoining the fight. A German soldier escaping a camp in Mississippi or Arizona was, for all intents and purposes, still neutralized. Third, and perhaps most crucially, these prisoners represented a massive, untapped labor pool that could solve a severe manpower shortage on the American home front. To accommodate this influx, the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General's office embarked on a massive construction program. The nation was divided into 9 service commands, and across 46 states, a network of over 500 camps sprang into existence. This included 155 large base camps, like Camp Hearne in Texas, Camp Clinton in Mississippi, and Papago Park in Arizona, which could hold several thousand men each. Radiating out from these were hundreds of smaller branch camps, often temporary and mobile, set up to provide labor wherever it was needed. The design and operation of these camps were strictly governed by the 1929 Geneva Convention, a treaty the United States adhered to with meticulous, almost obsessive precision. This was not merely an act of moral high-mindedness, it was a strategic calculation. The American leadership hoped that by treating German prisoners humanely, the German High Command would be compelled to reciprocate with the tens of thousands of American airmen and soldiers in their own POW camps. The convention dictated everything: the square footage of living space per man, the quality of medical care, access to recreation and religious services, and, most consequentially, the quantity and quality of their food. The regulations stated that prisoners of war must be given a diet equivalent to that of the detaining power's own depot troops. In the context of the American industrial and agricultural machine, a machine running at full unbridled capacity, this single rule would have an explosive psychological impact. While German civilians were surviving on 1,800 calories a day or less, the German POW in America was guaranteed a minimum of 3,000 to 4,000 calories, prepared in kitchens and served in mess halls built on a scale that reflected the sheer, unthinking abundance of the nation that had captured them. For Gefreiter Klaus Richter, the journey into captivity had been a descent into a carefully constructed vision of hell. The world he knew was one of scarcity, brutal efficiency, and ideological certainty. German propaganda, masterfully woven by Joseph Goebbels, had painted a terrifying picture of what awaited a captured Lancer. The Americans, they were told, were a mongrel race of gangsters and degenerates, culturally bankrupt and militarily weak, but capable of immense cruelty. They would be tortured for information, starved, and worked to death as slaves. The Soviets were, of course, presented as subhuman beasts from whom capture meant certain agonizing death. The Americans were merely a slightly more civilized variant of the same fate. His capture in the Tunisian desert was a blur of chaos and humiliation. The myth of German invincibility, already cracked by the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies, shattered completely. He had watched American Sherman tanks, seemingly infinite in number, roll over the horizon while his own unit's last Panzer IV sat immobile, out of fuel. He had seen swarms of P-40 Warhawks and P-38 Lightnings control the sky. This was not a battle of men against men, but of a fully stocked factory against a struggling workshop. The initial processing was disorienting. Stripped of his weapons, his personal effects catalogued, he was herded with thousands of others into vast barbed wire enclosures under the blistering North African sun. The food was minimal, the water rationed. This, he thought, was the beginning. It aligned perfectly with his expectations. Then came the sea voyage. He was packed shoulder to shoulder with his comrades deep in the hold of a Liberty ship, a vessel that was itself a symbol of the enemy's impossible production capacity. For weeks they wallowed in the darkness, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and seasickness, listening to the groaning hull and the constant, unnerving thrum of the engines. They spoke in low murmurs, sharing rumors and reinforcing their fears. They would be sent to labor camps in the frozen wastes of Canada, or perhaps put to work in the dangerous mines of Pennsylvania. Their guards were distant, efficient, and offered no information, their silence only amplifying the prisoners' dread. Stepping onto American soil in Norfolk, Virginia, was another shock. The sheer scale of the port, the endless lines of ships, the cranes moving with tireless energy, the well-fed dock workers. It was a spectacle of power that dwarfed anything he had seen in Hamburg. Then came the train journey. For days they rattled across a continent. Guarded, yes, but through the barred windows they witnessed a country seemingly untouched by war. There were no bombed-out buildings, no craters in the roads. They saw endless fields of corn and wheat, vast herds of cattle, cities glittering with electric lights at night, a direct and jarring contradiction to the blacked-out, rationed and crumbling homeland they were fighting to defend. Every mile of track laid bare the lie they had been told, that America was a nation on the verge of collapse. This was not a nation struggling. This was a nation flexing its industrial and agricultural muscle with an effortless, terrifying grace. By the time Klaus Richter's train shuddered to a halt in Hearne, Texas, he was physically and emotionally depleted, braced for the brutality he had been promised, entirely unprepared for the psychological assault that was about to begin. From the American perspective, the arrival of 378,000 German soldiers on their soil was a matter of grave concern, tinged with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and outright hostility. For the average American citizen, the German soldier was a figure shaped by war films, propaganda posters, and newsreels. He was either a jackbooted, monocled automaton barking orders, the arrogant Prussian stereotype, or a fanatical, goose-stepping Nazi, brainwashed from youth by the Hitler Youth and utterly devoted to his Führer. The men who would be guarding and managing these prisoners, from the Provost Marshal General's office down to the buck privates walking the perimeter fences in Texas, prepared for the worst. The primary concern was security. The U.S. Army anticipated constant organized escape attempts. They studied German methodology, expecting tunnels, forged documents, and coordinated efforts to break out and conduct sabotage. High-profile prisoners, especially U-boat crews and Luftwaffe pilots, were considered particularly high risk. Camps like Papago Park in Arizona were built in the harshest possible environments, on the theory that even if a prisoner escaped the wire, the desert itself would be an inescapable second prison. Guard towers were heavily manned, fences were illuminated by powerful searchlights, and regular, meticulous head counts were the norm. The second major fear was ideological contamination. Military intelligence was acutely aware that the German army was not a monolith. Within the prisoner population were ardent, hardline Nazis who would seek to impose their will on their fellow captives. They were expected to form secret camp Gestapos, bullying, intimidating, and even murdering those who showed signs of wavering loyalty to the Third Reich. This internal conflict posed a significant threat to camp stability. The U.S. military administration had to develop strategies to identify and isolate these black prisoners, the incorrigible, Nazis from the white anti-Nazi and gray apolitical prisoners. This was a difficult and dangerous intelligence game played within the confines of the barbed wire. Furthermore, there was the reaction of the American public to consider. For communities near the camps, the presence of thousands of enemy soldiers was a source of constant anxiety. These were the very men who had been killing their sons, brothers, and husbands overseas. Rumors flew. The POWs were being coddled. They were eating steak while Americans at home were dealing with meat rationing. This resentment was a political powder keg. The Army had to maintain a delicate balance, fulfilling its obligations under the Geneva Convention, while assuring the American public that the prisoners were not being pampered. Signs were often posted outside camps reminding locals not to fraternize with or harass the prisoners. The American guards themselves, many of whom were soldiers deemed unfit for combat duty or were training for deployment, often shared this resentment. They expected to be managing a horde of arrogant, dangerous fanatics. They too were unprepared for the reality of the men they were about to guard. The first stage of Klaus Richter's induction into Camp Herne was a systematic stripping away of his former identity. He and the other new arrivals were marched into a processing building, a long, low structure smelling sharply of disinfectant. Here, they were ordered to undress completely. Their filthy, lice-infested uniforms were bundled up, not to be burned as they expected, but to be laundered, fumigated, and repaired. Klaus felt a pang of loss as he watched the worn fabric, the only tangible link to his life as a soldier, disappear into a pile. Next came the delousing. American medics wearing rubber gloves and masks worked with an impersonal efficiency, dusting every man from head to toe with a fine white powder from a pressurized sprayer. It was DDT. For the Germans, who had been battling typhus and other vermin-borne diseases for years, the sheer availability of such a chemical in such quantities was the first small shock. They were then herded into a shower block. Rows of shower heads blasted seemingly endless streams of hot, high-pressure water. Klaus stood under the spray, the grime of months of combat and travel washing away. He hadn't felt such a simple, profound luxury since before the war began. There was soap. Great, thick bars of it, not the gritty, fat-rendered ersatz soap he was used to back home. After the showers, they were issued new clothing. Instead of a prison uniform, they were handed U.S. Army surplus fatigues, dyed a distinctive dark blue, with the letters PW stenciled in large white blocks on the back and legs. The clothes were sturdy, clean, and most surprisingly, they fit. They were also given fresh underwear, socks, and a pair of solid work boots. Dressed in his new attire, Klaus felt less like a captured warrior and more like an anonymous workman, his identity scrubbed clean. Then came the mess hall. The procession of clean, disoriented men was led into the cavernous building he had seen from the truck. The sheer scale of the interior was dumbfounding. It was a sea of wooden tables and benches, stretching out in perfect rows, capable of seating well over 1,000 men at once. The ceiling was high, the screened windows vast, and the floor was spotlessly clean. At one end was the serving line, a long stainless steel counter gleaming under electric lights. Behind it, prisoner cooks, supervised by American mess sergeants, moved with practiced ease, doling out food from enormous steaming vats. As Klaus moved along the line, a heavy-duty plastic tray in his hands, his disbelief deepened with each step. First, a ladle of thick beef stew, rich with chunks of meat and vegetables. Then a scoop of mashed potatoes, onto which was poured a river of brown gravy. Next, a pile of green beans. Then came the bread, It wasn't the dense, dark, sawdust-filled Kriegsbrot, war bread of Germany. It was slices of soft, perfectly white bread, and next to it a tub of yellow butter, real butter. An American cook's helper nonchalantly dropped 2 slices onto his tray. At the end of the line was coffee, steaming and fragrant in a large mug. A huge bowl of granulated sugar stood beside it, with a scoop for the taking. Klaus watched men ahead of him spooning in 2, even 3 heaps of the precious crystals. For dessert, there was a slice of apple pie. Klaus found a seat at one of the long tables, his movements stiff, almost robotic. He stared at the tray. It held more food of a higher quality than he had seen in a single meal in over 3 years. It was likely more food than his entire family in Hamburg would eat in 2 days. He picked up the white bread, felt its impossible softness. He put it to his mouth and tasted it. It was like cake. A fellow prisoner next to him began to weep silently, his shoulders shaking as he stared at his own tray. Another laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound on the edge of madness. Klaus looked around the vast hall, at the hundreds of his comrades, all in the same state of shock, and then back at the impossible abundance of food before him. This wasn't a prison. It was a dream, or perhaps a nightmare of a different kind. The foundation of his world, built on sacrifice, scarcity, and the righteousness of Germany's struggle, was being washed away by a tide of gravy. The initial shock of the first meal did not fade. It became the new bewildering reality. Day after day, the abundance continued, relentless and systematic. Breakfast brought scrambled eggs, bacon, pancakes, milk, and more of that endless coffee. Lunch and dinner offered a rotating menu of roast beef, chicken, pork chops, and a variety of vegetables and fruits that many of the Germans had only ever read about. The prisoners quickly learned that they could go back for second helpings. No one stopped them. In fact, it was encouraged, as the American quartermasters were under strict orders to cook the prescribed amount of food, and throwing it away was considered wasteful. This sustained, overwhelming display of material wealth began to work on the prisoners' minds in a way no propaganda leaflet ever could. It was an insidious and highly effective form of psychological warfare. The core narrative of the Nazi regime was that Germany, a nation of superior people, had been victimized and strangled by decadent, weak, and internally collapsing powers like the United States. Every meal served in Camp Herne was a direct, irrefutable contradiction of that narrative. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could a nation engaged in a globe-spanning 2-front war afford to feed its enemies so lavishly? The prisoners, many of whom were farmers, laborers, and factory workers, understood logistics. They knew what it took to grow, transport, and prepare food on this scale. They saw the trucks arriving daily, laden with fresh produce. They saw the well-stocked warehouses. Their own homeland was being systematically starved by Allied blockades and crippled by round-the-clock bombing. Their wives and mothers wrote of turnip winters and a constant gnawing hunger. Yet here, in the heart of the enemy nation, they were gaining weight. Their health was improving. They were stronger and better fed as prisoners than they had been as frontline soldiers for the Reich. This weapon of plenty extended beyond the mess hall. The camp canteen, or PX, was another front in this psychological war. The prisoners were put to work, as per the Geneva Convention, on local farms and in non-war-related industries. They picked cotton, harvested vegetables, and cut pulpwood, earning 80 cents a day in canteen scrip. With this scrip, they could buy items that were unheard-of luxuries in wartime Germany. Coca-Cola, cigarettes, Hershey's chocolate bars, magazines, writing paper, even beer with 3.2% alcohol content. The ability to purchase these small luxuries, to exercise a minor degree of economic freedom, further eroded the prisoners' sense of deprivation and restored a sliver of individual agency. The unexpected outcome was the quiet, creeping death of their ideological fervor. It's difficult to maintain a belief in the imminent collapse of your enemy when you are drinking his Coca-Cola and eating his apple pie. The constant, undeniable evidence of America's vast resources and productive power chipped away at the foundations of Nazi propaganda. The master race was being fed by the mongrel degenerates, and fed well. For many, suspicion turned to confusion to grudging respect, and respect to a deep and unsettling questioning of everything they had been taught to believe and for which they had been willing to die. The psychological journey of the German POW in America was a complex, multi-stage process of ideological unraveling. The first stage, as experienced by Klaus Richter, was pure shock and disbelief, often accompanied by deep suspicion. Many prisoners initially believed the extravagant meals were a cruel trick. They were being fattened up for some nefarious purpose, perhaps for slave labor in a harsher climate, or even for medical experiments. This paranoia, born from years of exposure to their own regime's cynical propaganda, slowly faded as the routine of abundance became unshakably consistent. The second stage was a profound sense of shame and humiliation. The letters from home became painful artifacts from another reality. A mother would write with joy about receiving an extra egg on her ration card, while her son had just eaten bacon and scrambled eggs for breakfast. A wife would describe mending the same dress for the third time, while her husband had been issued new, sturdy clothing. This disparity created a deep internal conflict. The prisoners felt a disconnect from the suffering of their own people, a sense of guilt that they were living in relative comfort while their families endured privation and bombing raids. This guilt often morphed into anger, not at their captors, but at their own leadership who had led their nation into a disastrous war against an enemy of such overwhelming power. The third and most transformative stage was reevaluation. With their basic needs met and their minds free from the constant stress of combat, the prisoners had something they hadn't had in years: time to think. The camp libraries, stocked with American books and magazines, carefully curated to exclude overtly propagandistic material, offered a window into a different world. They read about American history, its political system, and its culture. They saw magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post, with their vibrant advertisements for cars, refrigerators, and washing machines, depicting a level of consumer comfort that seemed like science fiction. The Americans also began a subtle but deliberate re-education program. They showed films, Hollywood movies, documentaries, and most devastatingly, newsreels. As the war drew to a close, prisoners were shown uncensored footage from the newly liberated concentration camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. For the vast majority of common German soldiers, who had been kept ignorant of the full scale of the Holocaust, this was a soul-shattering revelation. The images of walking skeletons and piles of corpses, filmed by American and British Army cameramen, were undeniable. The comfortable life in the POW camp, which had seemed like a strange blessing, was suddenly cast in a new, horrifying light. It stood in stark contrast to the unimaginable evil their own nation had perpetrated. The combination of American generosity and the horrific truth about the Nazi regime was a 1-2 punch that knocked the ideological stuffing out of all but the most fanatical prisoners. The cafeteria had fed their bodies, but the newsreels captured their souls, forcing a reckoning that would define the rest of their lives. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the story of the German prisoners in America was far from over. Repatriation was a slow and complex process. For many POWs, the news of Germany's total defeat and the division of their country was a final crushing blow. They were now citizens of a ruined nation, returning to bombed-out cities and uncertain futures. The return journey was a stark reversal of their arrival. They left the abundance of America for the rubble of Europe. The impact of their time in the Golden Cage, as many prisoners later called it, was profound and long-lasting. The 378,000 men who returned to Germany carried with them an intimate first-hand understanding of the United States. They had witnessed its industrial might, its agricultural bounty, and most importantly, its democratic and humane values, at least as they were applied within the confines of the Geneva Convention. They had been treated not as subhuman enemies, but as fellow soldiers on the losing side of a war. This shared experience created a unique and influential cohort within post-war German society. In the nascent years of the Cold War, as West Germany was being rebuilt and integrated into the Western Alliance, these former POWs became invaluable assets. They were a population immune to anti-American Soviet propaganda. When Moscow decried the Americans as capitalist imperialists, hundreds of thousands of German men knew differently. They remembered the white bread, the Hershey bars, and the fair treatment. They became informal ambassadors for the United States in their towns and villages, helping to build the foundation of trust and mutual respect that would become the bedrock of the NATO alliance. Many held on to their American experience for the rest of their lives. Some subscribed to American magazines for years after returning home. Others maintained lifelong correspondence with the American families whose farms they had worked on. A not insignificant number, after seeing the destruction in Germany, applied for and were granted permission to immigrate back to the United States, becoming American citizens. The story of the German POWs and the cafeterias bigger than their hometown squares is more than a historical curiosity. It is a powerful lesson in the effectiveness of soft power. In the midst of the most brutal conflict in human history, the United States won a significant victory not on the battlefield, but in the mess halls of Texas and Mississippi. By choosing to adhere to its principles and leveraging its greatest asset, its immense productive capacity, America did more than just house its enemies. It transformed them. For Klaus Richter and hundreds of thousands like him, the war ended not with the crack of a rifle, but with the clatter of a fork on a plastic tray, a quiet, personal surrender to an enemy that defeated them with overwhelming, undeniable, and life-altering kindness.